The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar of the International Fleet Managers Institute, the IFMI. My name is Steven Schoefs and I am the Chief Editor of Fleet Europe, and I will be your host throughout this webinar. We are really happy that you can all join to this webinar on diesel or petrol. Pick the right fuel for your corporate fleet. The IFMI stands for International Fleet Managers Institute. It is the dedicated training sharing platform for international fleet managers only. The IFMI also stimulates forward action and it triggers innovative thinking in vehicle fleet management. Last but not least, the IFMI focuses on best practice sharing and interaction. Also in this webinar, you will have the opportunity to learn from recognized fleet peers, and at the end of this webinar, there is even the possibility to ask your questions to our experts in a lively Q&A. But first, a little explanation on the topic of today: diesel or petrol for your fleet. To diesel or not to diesel? That is the question facing many fleet managers today as they weigh the inherent advantages and disadvantages of diesel against those of other fuel types and against the changing fiscal landscape. Diesel, of course, remains a very popular choice for fleet cars in Europe. But across Europe, the concern for the environment is getting bigger and bigger, with more governments turning up the pressure on diesel and imposing higher taxes and banning them from city centers in an attempt to phase out the fuel that is considered very polluting. From the fleet driver perspective, we see new mobility patterns for sure in dense and urban city centers. All these factors together lead to a very complex picture about the cost effectiveness of the fuel relevant to your particular situation. So yes, you are today in the right webinar, as it might be the time for you to consider a switch for your fleet, or at least a part of it. The first expert today will guide you through some taxation and legislation elements with regard to diesel and petrol in Europe. Our acknowledged speaker today is Mr. Erwin Bouwmans, partner of BDO Belgium. Erwin, I hope that you can hear me, and if so, the webinar floor is yours.
Thank you, Steven. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm happy to be able to speak today on behalf of BDO for the International Fleet Managers Institute on this fascinating topic. So I was asked to give a small scene setting from a regulatory point of view. Because as we noticed historically in most countries, diesel cars were usually the preferred choice, and this mainly due to a greater fuel economy, lower CO2 emissions, and certainly in the years before Dieselgate, usually a lower benefit in kind taxation in the hands of the driver, and this compensated partly or greatly for the potential additional acquisition costs, which may have been a bit higher in case of diesel cars. So next slide, please. Following Dieselgate, but also already before, we saw that there was a tendency to start taxing more polluting cars and also introducing other types of restrictions on more polluting cars. On the other hand, we also noticed that from a technical point of view, petrol cars are getting cheaper and cleaner, and this is causing, certainly the last couple of years, a certain mind switch. What we noticed is that there is certainly an increased taxation of diesel vehicles, and this both in the hands of employers as well as for the employees. And we believe that there is a clear link between this increase in taxation and the Dieselgate affair of a couple of years ago. First of all, we noticed that on the acquisition of vehicles, the registration taxes have been increased or have been increasing over the last couple of years, and mainly due to the abolishment of tax incentives which were based on CO2 emissions standards only, and now have been there's a use of a variety of emission standards which are being used, so not only CO2. Secondly, also on usage, we see an increased excise duty rate on diesel fuel in certain countries, and we also see an increase in circulation taxes in certain cases, and even in respect to benefit-in-kind taxation. Next to that, we have, of course, an improved performance in cleaner petrol engines, which generally also, of course, impacted the taxes due on these vehicles in the framework of their acquisition or use. Besides that, also other incentives, or let's say restrictions, have been introduced, and then we basically can distinguish three types of such initiatives. First of all, lower emission zones, which have been introduced certainly in major cities in the last couple of years, but now it's really getting widespread throughout Europe and even in the world. Next to that, we have urban access regulations, which are popping up, and finally also certain charging schemes, which here and there we see more and more. In order to give you maybe a clearer view on these three types of specific measures, we have made a small overview of these measures, and in this respect I've made use of a website which is referenced down below, and which could be useful in case you as a fleet owner need to check whether or not there are specific regulations in certain areas where you or your people are active. First of all, you see here a small map giving an overview of the lower emission zones which are already there, either planned in Europe. We noticed, if you look at more into detail on these initiatives, that initially these were destined for older vehicles. However, the norms in this respect can also be adjusted. I indicated quickly, it can be done overnight, but usually this is not being done, of course, in order to get people to prepare themselves for these changes. But in any case, it is possible to adjust these norms. And we noticed this already, for instance, in London, where the lower emission zone is already active for a couple of years, but that they are thinking now of introducing a so-called ultra-low emission zone as soon as from the 8th April of 2019, leading to additional surcharges for even Euro 6 diesel cars. Last year, or beginning of the year, in Antwerp, there was an introduction in Belgium of lower emission zones, which is initially only destined for older vehicles, but in 2020 also Euro 5 norm diesels will be impacted. Okay, so next slide, please. This is similar, let's say, map, but here we see the overview of certain access regulation schemes which exist in Europe, which in most cases still focus on heavy-duty vehicles, but this is not always the case. You have certain pedestrian-only zones, and also you see a tendency in banning all polluting vehicles. For example, in Paris, where the mayor announced that by 2025 they want all polluting vehicles to be out of the city center. And then last but not least, we have a final map giving an overview of maybe the less popular, but still present in some cases, certain charging schemes whereby you have emission surcharge regimes or road or zone toll systems specifically designed towards, let's say, diesel and polluting vehicles. So this just as a summary, saying that there is certainly a trend towards taxation firstly, and secondly restricting access to certain areas for the more polluting cars, and certainly after Dieselgate it is clear that let's say the policy makers are focusing on diesel cars in particular. So Stephen, I'll give you back the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erwin, for already giving this comprehensive overview on taxation and legislation with regard to powertrains in Europe. for the participants in this webinar, and you are many, we are really happy with that. If you have a question, you can, of course, use the chat function in your webinar tool and ask your question to one of the experts. As we will still have some experts to go, it will also be really nice, of course, that you can indicate to whom your question needs to be addressed, so that makes, let's say, the moderation afterwards a little bit more fluently. So let's now go to one of the biggest questions that you might face today or tomorrow for your corporate car fleet, and that is, when is it time to switch your fuel in your fleet? And to give some insight, we have invited two experts. You can see them both here already on screen. We are really happy that Mr. Hervé Girardot from Arval and Mr. Matthijs van der Goot from LeasePlan International are ready to share information with you in this webinar. And I believe, Hervé, that you are going to kick off. So if you can hear me, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, and yes, good afternoon to everyone. Until now, with Erwin, we had a comprehensive overview of the regulatory aspect behind the diesel versus petrol equation. During this new session with Matthijs, we would like to have a look to the diesel versus petrol choice from more an operational and economical aspect. But before we get there, we wanted to have the opportunity to come back to the basics, in particular to have some preliminary observation on what we are talking about when looking at diesel and petrol from an emission perspective. Petrol and diesel are both burning fuel for fuel. Both produce a variety of emissions with different environmental implications. If we focus on the CO2 and NOx, which are the two main emissions that we all hear about in the media, we need to clarify that, first of all, CO2 is not a polluant and NOx is a polluant. The issue with CO2 is the overproduction, which contributes to Earth's global warming. Hence, some regulation to progressively reduce the level of CO2 emission to reach an average of 95 grams per kilometer in 2020 in average. NOx gas, on the other hand, react to form some smog and acid rain. It mainly impacts on the respiratory condition and increase the response to allergens. Basically, NOx has impact on health of citizens. Hence, the discussion today in terms of choosing the CO2 aspect or the NOx aspect from an emission standpoint of those two fuels. With this reminder about the different emissions and their impacts, we have to acknowledge a paradox about diesel, and this is what we want now to share on the next slide. The paradox we want to highlight is that diesel remains the most popular choice in the corporate fleet, despite continuous and intense campaign of one could call diesel bashing. And if we closely have a look at it, this popularity is explained by very obvious good reason. First of all, from a pure operational aspect, when you look at the range of products available only on the LCV segment, for example, the petrol choice is pretty limited versus the diesel. Second aspect will be the TCO perspective, and I will let Matthijs walk us through more in that one. And the last piece is more on the environmental aspect. We need to recognize the effort done by the regulation, and only on the NOx aspect, the shift from Euro 5 to Euro 6 has set new norms that is now putting very close, in theory, the diesel versus the petrol from an emission standpoint. Matthijs, if you can walk us through now more specifically on the economical equation behind diesel and petrol.
Yes, thank you, Hervé. Thank you for this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, I would like to talk about the economic impact, the TCO impact, total cost of ownership impact. And before I do so, maybe to introduce what is the average cost of fuel if it comes down to fleet. And you see here on the screen that on average there's 19% of the cost of a vehicle is fuel. And you can see that on the right hand, that is a TCO pie chart from basically all European countries with a mixture of petrol and diesel vehicles and a mixture of different term and mileage combinations. So this is really a European average, so to say. And what you can see here is that the diesel versus petrol is mostly impacted by the fuel part, the 19%. However, fuel choice, if it's diesel or petrol, also impacts the other TCO elements, since the different technology also impacts, for example, the catalog price of the vehicle, and therefore the depreciation is impacted, but also the different technology requires different maintenance schemes, and therefore also the R&D budget is impacted. If you look at what's happening and what is how is the TCO moving, first of all, you see that from a governmental perspective, as Erin rightly pointed out, that the TCO is increasing if it comes down to the fuel part. And I put on the slide 3 elements there, 3 examples that I found in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where you can see that from a government perspective, the VAT, the excise duty, or the benefit in kind taxation is changing, where you can see that the government favors or tries to equal diesel with the petrol. And so if you look at the TCO, you will see that the fuel part, that 90%, is slowly increasing for diesel in multiple countries. However, that's only the 19% of fuel. What you see here in the screen is also the 44%, which is the depreciation of the vehicle. And if you look at the depreciation, the strongest impact there is the residual value. And we looked into the residual value development within Europe. And what you see there is that there is, at this moment of time, no strong impact on the residual for the diesel vehicles yet. For example, you see that in countries like Germany and France, the residual for diesel remains stable, and you see even a light increase in countries like Netherlands, Spain, and Italy. You do see, if you compare it with the petrol development, for example, in France, that even if the diesel residual remains stable, that the residual for petrol vehicles in France increases, so therefore comparable, the petrol version is becoming more attractive. However, that really varies per market, but overall there is no single trend in Europe that the residual is changing. The second-hand market for diesels remains strong, and also the demand for new diesel vehicles remains strong. So yes, the TCO slightly impacted, especially on the fuel part because of the governmental impact, but if it comes down to the residual, there is no strong impact yet. Next slide, please. So that's the development. So what do you see? What's the current situation if it comes down to the petrol versus diesel comparison? And on this screen you have a comprehensive overview of the comparison in a country with diesel and a petrol vehicle. And what you see here on the screen, just to explain the graph, is B and C segment vehicles on an operational lease contract with an annual mileage of 20,000 kilometer. And what you see there as a concluding is that in 18 out of the 24 countries, you see that the diesel car is the less expensive option at this moment of time. Even if you had the annual mileage of 20,000 is relatively low mileage, if you increase that, you will see that more countries, you will see that the diesel is the less expensive option because of the lower pump price of diesel. So at this moment of time, you see that the diesel is for a fleet is still the more, from a TCO perspective, the more attractive option in most countries. And to go to the next slide, a question we always receive there is a logical question: what about the e-vehicles then? Is that already a viable solution for the diesel versus petrol, and what's moving there? And why? Well, electric vehicles, as you might know, they don't have any tailpipe emissions. And you see that many OEMs are working on the electric vehicles. Sales figures are expected even to increase to 20 million vehicles globally by 2020. A very strong increase of current sales figures. And why? Well, there's a couple of things moving on in the electric vehicles that it makes quite an attractive choice now. You see a very strong increase in range. You see that the new vehicles on the market, come up with a range of 500 kilometers, which in reality is probably 300 to 400. But that is a very attractive range already for your daily usage. You also see strong improvements if it comes down to the charging infrastructure. That means that there is many more public charging stations available, but also the cost of the private charging infrastructure goes down. And there is many more, or there is an increasing amount of vehicle choice. At the moment, there is not many vehicle choice in the popular C and D segment. For fleet, a very attractive segment. You don't see that many vehicles, but there are vehicles announced, and they will appear on the market shortly. So there is an increase in vehicle choice, and what you see there from a TCO perspective, and I've put two graphs on the screen here, two examples here. The first one is in the Netherlands, and the other one is in Norway. Both markets are very mature if it comes down to electrification and electric vehicle, and you can already see in those markets that the electric vehicle can be an attractive choice. For example, the C segment comparison in the Netherlands, you see the Hyundai Ioniq somewhere on the bottom of the TCO comparison. That means that it's a relatively attractive option already in that C segment. And in Norway, I've looked at the LCVs. You even see that the Nissan electric van is even leading the TCO comparison. I have to say that these are, of course, the most positive examples. If you look at other countries, in other segments, it's not always this case. And the big question here is, of course, when will that happen, and when will the other markets follow? And we will have a close look at this development, this very interesting development of electric vehicles. I would like to give the word back to Hervé for some concluding words.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matthijs. So time to conclude. To make a long story short, concerns rise about the diesel and NOx emission are valid. We need to recognize that from a corporate fleet standpoint, these concerns are more for all diesel cars on the road. And thanks to the Euro 6 new norms, the diesel vehicles that we have in the fleet are much closer than the petrol, message number one. Still, there are some obvious situations where petrol would be a greater choice than diesel, and this comes to some analysis in terms of low mileage, small engine, and urban usage, where this could be the right option. Need always to look at very specific patterns of usage in terms of city center, short distance commuting, etc., where here again some alternative energy are on the table that might be interesting to look at. So to conclude, and the key takeaway, there is no single right energy for all fleet and our customers, of course. And what you need to do is to have a granularity analysis of your fleet profile and your driving usage to make the right choice. Probably time now to start small, but starting now. Steven, giving back the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthijs and Hervé, for the comprehensive presentation. I'm sure that the participants, they will have some questions. So to the participants, if you have a question, please use the chat function in your webinar tool, and don't forget to also mention the name of the expert to whom your question will be addressed to. Thank you very much. We had already 3 experts that have given us, let's say, a framework about diesel and petrol, what the situation is today, where we are going tomorrow. And we wouldn't be the IFMI, the International Fleet Managers Institute, if we didn't include, let's say, also a best practice case study. And so the final part of this webinar today is a case study of Orange, a well-known company. And we have here among us Patrick Martinoli, who is Fleet Management Director, Facility and Management at Orange. And he has already taken some initiatives with his company in terms of shifting fuel types for his corporate fleet. And he is ready to share with us why he has done that, what he has done, and how he sees the future of his fleet in terms of fuel types and engines. Patrick, if you can hear me, yes, please, you can start.
Thank you, Steven. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Patrick Martinoli, and I will explain you what we do in Orange, even the words of Mathis and Hervé that who are thinking that there is no high signal to switch now, but for us and regarding the different policy in France, we have things that we must move on. So Orange is a French telco company, up to 41 billion euro of revenue per year. We have 85,000 people in France, 133,000 globally in the world. We have a large footprint in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Orange fleet in France, in my footprint, it's 19,500 vehicles, 33,000 for all the footprint of Orange. 98% of our cars are with diesel powertrain. In France, we have 9,000 company cars, 8,500 commercial utility cars, 155,000 benefit cars, and 5 special vehicles like boom lifts. We have developed for the last year, a large car sharing park with Mobility Tech Green, and we have up to 1,000 cars shared, and we will have up to 2,000 at the end of this year. Our target is about between 5,000 and 6,000 cars in car sharing. Car sharing is available in professional mode to have any journey for professional reasons, but during the evening and the weekend, the salaries of Orange can use in the private mode this car also. All our float is under 120 grams per kilometer of CO2. For company and commercial cars. For utility cars, it can be a little bit higher. So during the last 15 years in France, there was many arguments to promote diesel engine in large fleets. Fiscal arguments on diesel cars, maybe in particular for the VAT. The fuel cost, it was very low in France, the diesel cost. Diesel cars have low consumption. CO2 was decreasing at each new generation of cars from Euro 2 to Euro 6. And technology enhancement like FAPS, NOx trap, and AdBlue had diminished the polluting of this type of engine. Next slide, please. Thank you. But since 2012, anti-diesel voices grows. We have a lot of health warning on harmful emission, NOx and fine particle, and on the effect on the respiration system of everyone. Political will ban diesel technology from urban zone in the 2020 years. Paris, Grenoble, Strasbourg, and even Aix-en-Provence has announced for 2018 the ban of all petrol and diesel ban from the city. French taxation evolution is announced for the next 5 years. The target is to align taxation of diesel on the petrol taxation, which is unfortunately higher than diesel. Necessity to use the right cars at the right time. It's one of our credo in Orange. We think that we must not consider now that the car is universal. We must consider that we have to use the good car for the good trip. diesel must not be used for short trips. Electric vehicle must not be used to go on the motorway, and inside that, the petrol car and the hybrid car have all their opportunity to drive. So for this year, we have defined a new mix energetic for our fleet. Under 12,000 kilometers per year, electric vehicles, and especially in urban zone, electric vehicles must be choose if it's possible. Between 12 and 22,000 kilometers per year, we must have petrol cars and hybrid cars, rechargeable or not. And only over 22,000 kilometers per year, we accept diesel car now. Okay. Promoting such a mix energetic, is really a triple bet. First one, fuel and petrol costs will grow. So at each step of the augmentation of the cost of the petrol, the EVs will get a better TCO. We have a better TCO than diesel car. So when the petrol will be at $80 per barrel, we think that the TCO will be better. Secondly, our vehicle have less driven in the last 4 years that we expect, and this is a technical and financial advantage for petrol powertrained vehicles. Really, it's very. We have discovered that our cars really drive only 16,000 kilometers per year. So a large part of our fleet can be used with petrol powertrain. And the same taxation is expected for petrol and diesel cars, and we hope that it can arrive, but maybe more quick than expected now. So we have fixed some target for this year. First one, we want to multiply by 2 the park of EVs. Last year, at the end of last year, we had 300 cars. At the end of this year, we will have 600, and at the end of next year, we want to have 1,200 electric cars. And half of the vehicle renewed in 2017, passenger and company car, for sure, must be petrol engines. The minimum of the renewals will be on 700 cars. So we have made a specific deal to promote the new C3 petrol engine in manual or automatic gearbox. And in fact, to answer to some critical of the drivers which prefer diesel car because of the easy drive with that, because he had a lot of torque, we have proposed the C3 in 115 horsepower and automatic gearbox to have the same comfortable drive than the diesel, and it is at the same cost than the Clio diesel 19 HP. So at the end, maybe one wish: car makers don't have a sufficient offer on petrol or hybrid engines, especially for the utilities cars and the light trucks. And we want to have to find this proposal in the car makers' offer. Thank you very much.
Patrick, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us and to share with you your case study on Orange. I'm sure that there will be some questions, so we will now go to the Q&A round that we will have with all the experts. You can see them on your screens, and if you have a question for them, please send it via the chat function so that we can moderate a lively Q&A. Erwin, the first question is for you, so if you can unmute yourself, that would be nice. Yes, here we go. We see that in terms of taxation legislation, that at the moment in Europe, for sure, diesel cars, let's say, are punished, and for sure also in city centers and so on. And now we know that governments, they will always need income and money. So the question is related to the fact, what is your vision, what is your knowledge about what will happen with taxation for petrol cars and electric cars if everyone makes the switch to those type of cars?
Okay, so Stephen, thank you. Well, like you correctly stated, vehicles and car taxation and etc. have been a very interesting source of income for government. And we already noticed that a couple of years ago, where there was a huge, there were countries and several countries invested hugely in different types of incentives focused on, let's say, introducing, for instance, electric vehicles, that some or a lot of those countries already came back from these incentives because they start to cost too much money. I think Norway in particular is a very good example of that. And indeed, if everyone would start switching to another type of engine, and this would lead to a drastic reduction of source of income, I believe that the government or the authorities will certainly start to look at another way of taxation, or maybe abolishing certain incentives in order to compensate for this loss of income. On the other hand, it is of course also, there's also an ecological philosophy behind all of this, and there is indeed a need in order to combat pollution and make our cities more viable and more livable again. So I think the challenge will be to have a balance between these two important challenges. So first of all, finding money, and secondly, also making the earth a pleasant place to live on. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Erwin. The second question is for Hervé Girardot of Arval. Hervé, the question is as follows. Today, we are still using the official, let's say, OEM CO2 values in order to see how we can be green. Do you expect a shift in the choice of fuel types, etc., and drivetrains once the real CO2 emissions will become, let's say, the benchmark?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Stephen, for that. We know that with the Dieselgate, there was a lot of concern about the reliability and the accuracy of the data and the numbers that were provided by the OEMs that are somehow embedded in the calculation of the different TCO. So obviously, the more we will get to reliable and sustainable measurement system about those data, and in particular the level of emission of CO2 and NOx, the more transparency we will have on actual real-life situation versus test situation for those emissions. The more the market will have that reliability, the more we will have apple-to-apple comparison available. And this is where the equation that has been mentioned by Patrick, in terms of adapting your fleet to your very specific situation in terms of urban, in terms of short distance, in terms of driver profile, will really make sense. So all the trends, so to make a long story short, all the trend we see around the reliability of the data that we are looking for, looking on to make the benchmark will help us making the right choice in the future.
I'm going to Matthijs van der Gold of Leaseplan. Matthijs, a question for one of the lease experts, and so you are here as one of the lease experts. There is the understanding and the belief that the car manufacturers are working on the next generations of batteries, on the next generation of powertrains, and that, let's say, in terms of the batteries for EVs, the next generation will be available around 2025. And it is expected that that new technology will reduce the cost of EVs and extend, let's say, also the possible range to 300 kilometers, 500 kilometers. At the same point, the cost of an electric vehicle could be equal, let's say, to that of a modern diesel. Do you also have such forecasts, and how are you going to deal with that also in terms of leasing rates, residual value setting, and so on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question indeed, thanks. What you do see indeed, there is worldwide, there's a lot of research if it comes down to battery technology. I think there's a lot of research coming from even the Chinese markets, but also within Europe and the US. Batteries are, as some of the manufacturings are telling us now, batteries are the new gold. And batteries are very valuable to be charged and to have the energy on it. And what you see is with all the research coming up on the batteries is they get better by the day. Every day there is an increase in battery in terms of what the range of that, therefore the range of the vehicle will be. And what you see is that the batteries will take a longer range, but also they don't decompose that fast. The expectation in the beginning also was that after 4 years' time, the batteries can only be charged to 20-30% of the capacity, but that's not the case. It turns out that after 4 years' time, the battery will still have a lot of capacity and therefore also very attractive to remark and therefore also very attractive for the residual. So that's the good news, and I think that will be impacted on the leasing cost. I think at the moment, if you come to the more expensive electric vehicles, such as the Teslas, they are not very comparable for a normal fleet driver. But I think there is more vehicles coming on the road that are more suitable in the C and the D segment with an acceptable range, with against acceptable costs, and therefore also the leasing cost will go down. I think in the near future, leasing of an electric vehicle will be a very viable alternative compared to the diesels or petrols. Yeah.
Okay, because and that's also linked to the next question, and please, Matthijs, you can briefly continue. If then I understand right, that although you have mentioned in your presentation that at the moment the residual values for diesel cars currently remain stable and attractive compared to that of other powertrains, that you are already a little bit reviewing, let's say, also the residual values and the risks in terms of the other powertrains to make sure that the future balance in your fleet mix is the right one, because we are working here with, let's say, cycles of 3 to 5 years in fleet. So if a fleet manager today has to choose and buy lease his vehicles, of course it will have an effect in 3 to 5 years time. So I can imagine that also you already, from a lease provider point of view, that you are also taking that into account. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are very closely monitoring the second-hand sales of the electric vehicles. Because if you remarket now a vehicle for 3-4 years ago, You can see what the actual value of those vehicles is. It's still a young market, I have to admit. If you remark a vehicle now that is 3-4 years old, there's not that many e-vehicles coming on that second-hand market yet. But the numbers are increasing. As I told in my story, the global sales are expected to come up to 20 million by 2020. And that will have an impact on the RV. Of course, question is, when will that be an attractive alternative in all markets? So I would definitely advise to closely monitor that. But I believe that it will be a very attractive TCO in the near future. Yeah.
Okay. Patrick Martinoli, as case study speaker, of course, there are some questions for you, and the first one is quite straightforward. Can you please indicate for which countries you are already able to roll out your electric car policy, let's say, and how did you do that? What was the easiest country or the easiest, let's say, division in your company to do that with, and what did you do exactly to make sure that the rollout of that plan is efficiently done?
Yeah, Orange is a little bit complex company, and I manage the car and drive the car policy for France, and I only give some advices for the rest of the footprint, and all my presentation was based on the French fleet. In the other countries, they are adapting all that with their own decision, and I cannot manage really all the fleet, but I can only give advices.
Okay. Another question for you is related to the figures that you have indicated in terms of, let's say, the energy mix that you have decided to implement. You have figures of 12,000 kilometers a year and 22,000 kilometers a year. How have you calculated this? On what are these figures based?
First of all, we have in each our cars a telematic system that gives us all the kilometers per day, and we have analyzed all the park mileage, and we have find the really kilometers driven by all the car with this system. And when we analyze that, and when we consider technical constraint of the different powertrain, we have determined that 22,000 kilometers per year is a good mileage to decide to switch from petrol to diesel. Under at 1,200 kilometers, it's a little bit more difficult to determine what is the good point, because we have to balance the mileage with the situation of the car. Is it inside a large town? Is it in an urban on an urban site? Is it in a low emission zone or not, and so on?
Okay. Thank you very much. Erwin, another question for you. It's related to something that also you presented. You had, let's say, a slide in which you gave an overview of the low emission zones, also related to some of the city bands. And the question is related to that. In what way are you up to date, let's say, on the fact that the city bands will not be extended to the Euro 6 diesel? Is that true? And what are the next steps, let's say, in order to make sure what will happen and that fleet managers can also align their policy in the best possible way?
Well, first of all, I do not immediately see that in a lot of countries or cities, Euro 6 diesels would be banned. That's the first thing. On the other hand, you have certain politicians making statements, like the mayor of France, of Paris, sorry, on banning all diesel vehicles. You also have the plans in London on the ultra low emission zone, whereby, based on information I have, also diesel 6 norm vehicles are being targeted. Not that they are completely banned, but at least that they will need to pay some type of surcharge. So the fact is that partly it's, of course, some politics are involved as well, of course. But again, I think what fleet owners can do, or fleet managers can and always should do, is closely follow up on communication and on let's say, follow up on information that's being released by different organizations, like for instance Fleet Europe, but also certainly by certain local or international automotive organizations like ASEA, which can clearly and also closely follow up on these events. Again, also the website that I mentioned gives an overview. I'm not saying that this is 100% reliable, but I think it's, if you can, let's say, base yourself on different sources, it is always, I think, best that you are well informed before you take any decision. Hope this helps answering the question.
Okay. Two more questions. The first one is for Hervé Girardot of Arval. Hervé, in the presentation that you did together with Matthijs, there was, let's say, in one of the slides, the mentioning of that today in many countries and many situations, in terms of TCO, diesel still might be the most attractive, although that when, for example, a typical specific use like the use in a city center, or when you do a lower mileage, then a petrol vehicle can become more attractive and more interesting. Do you already have some kind of idea about the tipping point when, in terms of mileage, the switch can be, let's say, can become interesting?
Well, this is spot on. Yes, we obviously have some tipping point studies. So basically, we are comparing by segment, by range of mileage, and by condition of usage, what are the TCO when comparing diesel versus petrol. And yes, we are making some publication in terms of tipping point. I have just to say that we need to be careful with those numbers. It's pretty much indicative. Obviously, it needs to be compared from a make-model perspective, a country perspective, with a couple of very specific situation from the city, looking at also the taxation aspect. Coming back to your question, Stephen, in terms of reliability of the OEM data that sometimes are taken into consideration for the calculation of TCO, at least for the fuel piece. But yes, we are partnering with our customer to make those kind of regular analysis of the tipping point, and to help them choose the right break-even mileage per year where it really makes sense shifting to petrol.
Okay, good. And Matthijs, when do you think that we can, let's say, in general speak, that the TCO of a petrol car will become more attractive in Europe than the one of the diesel car?
The petrol car, good question, not so sure. I think I do believe that low mileage petrol is the better choice, and if you face a risk of business continuity in not being able to access city centers, I think referring back to the discussion we had on the Euro 6, that at the moment there's not many cities blocking Euro 6 diesels, but keep in mind that things change, and if you order now a diesel 6 vehicle, in 4 years time when it's still on the road, that might have changed. So in terms of risk mitigation, it might be a better option for certain business users, and also for lower mileage, that the petrol is the better option. However, if you have 30,000 mileage without specific business usage in the cities at the moment, and I do believe that that will remain for now the case, that diesel is the better option.
Okay. Thank you. And then the final question is for Patrick Martinoli. Patrick, you already have quite a lot in France. Diesel vehicles, you have more and more petrol vehicles, you also have electric powertrains, but of course when you implement electric powertrains, hybrid powertrains and so on into your fleet, you also have to make sure that your fleet drivers are using them in the right way. Because we have seen, for example, in some of the countries where there is such a tax advantage for some types of powertrains, that there is a huge demand and a huge sell, let's say, of those powertrains, but that the use of those powertrains is not done efficiently with higher fuel costs in the end for the fleet owner and the company. So what have you done in terms of driver behavior, in terms of steering of your drivers to use those new powertrains in the right way?
Yes. What we have to understand that to make a choice on the sort of powertrains is not sufficient. We must give to the driver the choice of the good car for the good trip at each moment. For this reason, we want to decrease the number of attribute cars and increase the number of shared cars. When people has not a designed car for him and must share the car, he can choose the good car at each moment. When you have to go inside Paris, he will take an electric vehicle. When you have to go all over the Paris suburban, he take a petrol car. And when you want to have a trip to Rouen or to Lyon, he will take a diesel car. And if he has his own car, it's not possible. So we want to decrease the attribute cars to increase the shared cars, and with this solution, we will be sure that the cars made the good mileage for what they were built.
Okay, thank you very much for your expertise, Patrick. We have come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank Erwin Bouwmans of BDO, Hervé Girardot of Arval, Matthijs van der Gold of LeasePlan, and of course Patrick Martinoli of Orange. Please don't forget that there will be a recorded version of this webinar that we will put in the upcoming days on our website, ifmi.fleeteurope.com. There will also be a little satisfaction survey for you to fill in and send back, because we want, of course, also hear how we can optimize a future IFMI webinar. And then, really important, we can already announce our 2 upcoming sessions of the International Fleet Managers Institute. On the 28th of September, we have a second webinar on another topic, of course. It's about the company car versus cash allowance, and also linking it to the rise, the increase, and the popularity of private lease. That's on the 28th of September. And on the 5th of December in Portugal, we have the full day training session for corporate fleet managers only, where we will talk about how you can take your fleet management on an international level and become even a more successful international and global fleet manager. And there also we will of course have several experts, and there will be a focus on case studies and best practice sharing. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar of the International Fleet Managers Institute, and I wish you a nice day. Thank you very much. Bye bye.